The air in my parents' living room always smelled like burnt sage and passive aggression. I stood in the doorway, clutching a still, warm apple pie, while my brother Kyle held court on the sofa. He wore a suit that cost more than my first car, holding a glass of scotch like a prop. At Thanksgiving, my brother joked, "He'll probably ask for leftovers." I just forced a smile. Then his girlfriend walked in, saw me, and froze. She whispered, "That's him." Pulled up her phone. Con and my aunt dropped her drink. The shattered glass sounded like a gunshot. Red wine bled across the beige carpet, creeping toward Aunt Linda's orthopedic shoes, but she didn't look down. She stared at the phone screen Lena held out with a trembling hand. Lena, a woman I had never formally met, looked at me with the primal terror usually reserved for apex predators. Kyle laughed, a nervous sound that died quickly when no one joined in. He looked between us, confusion wrinkling his forehead. "Babe, what is it?" Kyle asked, reaching for Lena's arm. She flinched, her eyes still locked on me. "You said his name was Sam," she hissed, her voice rising. "You didn't tell me he was S.J. Wright." My mother stepped out of the kitchen, wiping flour on her apron, oblivious to the shift in atmospheric pressure. To them, I was just Sam, the quiet failure who fixed their printers. To Lena, who evidently worked for my last target, I was the angel of death. "He's the auditor," Lena announced, pointing a finger at my chest. "The one who dismantled Apex Logistics. My boss is in prison because of him." The room erupted into whispers. My father looked up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing. I didn't move. I didn't defend myself. I just set the apple pie down on the entryway table. It felt ridiculous to be holding dessert while being accused of corporate manslaughter. Lena wasn't finished, though. She stepped closer, shielding Kyle like I was contagious. "You ruined 300 jobs," she spat. Kyle's face transformed. The confusion melted into a sneer, the same one he used when he stole my allowance as kids. "Is that what you do?" he asked, his voice dripping with performative disgust. "You ruin people for a living." Aunt Linda finally looked up from the wine stain, shaking her head. "We always knew something was wrong with you, Sam. So secretive, so cold." They didn't see competence. They saw a monster who hunted their kind. "I audit fraud," I said, my voice steady. "I don't ruin honest people." It was the most I had spoken at a family gathering in a decade. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother looked at me, not with pride for my success, but with fear. I realized then that the lie was over. I wasn't the disappointment anymore. I was the threat. I turned around, opened the front door, and walked out into the cold November air, leaving the pie behind. I didn't get far before the front door swung open again. My father stood on the porch, his silhouette framed by the warm, deceptive light of the hallway. He didn't chase me to apologize. He just crossed his arms, shivering in his flannel shirt, and shook his head with that familiar, exhausted disappointment. "Always the drama with you, Sam," he called out, his voice thin against the wind. "Couldn't just let us have one nice meal." He didn't wait for a response before closing the door. The drive back to the city was a blur of taillights and static radio. I kept the heater off, letting the chill numb the humiliation burning under my skin. For years, I had parked my leased sedan around the corner and walked to their house to avoid questions about my finances. Tonight, that charade felt pathetic. I merged onto the expressway, pushing the engine harder than necessary, putting miles between myself and the people who claimed to love me only when I was beneath them. My apartment was exactly how I left it: silent, pristine, and expensive. I threw my keys on the quartz island and stripped off the thrift store sweater I wore to play the part of the struggling son. Underneath, I was S.J. Wright, a man who billed $400 an hour to find what CEOs tried to hide. I poured a glass of whiskey, a rare Japanese blend I kept for victories, though this felt more like a wake. The skyline glittered outside, indifferent and beautiful. My pocket buzzed, vibrating against the marble countertop like an angry insect. I knew I shouldn't look, but the masochistic urge won out. It was a notification from the Wright family Thanksgiving group chat. Mom had posted a photo. They were gathered around the table, forks raised, smiles plastered on faces flush with wine. At the end of the table, where I had been sitting minutes ago, was a gap. They hadn't even moved the chair. They just cropped the frame to center Kyle. A second message appeared, separate from the group. It was from Kyle. The preview text alone made my stomach turn over. Don't bother coming for Christmas," it read. "Lena is literally shaking. You really traumatized her, Sam. I hope you are proud of yourself." There was no question about my side of the story. No curiosity about the fraud I had uncovered. Just immediate, protective allegiance to the lie. They preferred the golden boy's girlfriend to the son who told the truth. I stared at the phone until the screen went dark. A heavy, suffocating grief pressed down on my chest, the weight of 30 years of trying to fit into a box that was too small. Then, abruptly, the pressure snapped. I didn't throw the glass. I didn't scream. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling whiteboard in my home office, grabbed an eraser, and wiped away the schedule I had cleared for family visits. The white space looked inviting. I picked up a black marker. Before I could recap the marker, my laptop chimed with a priority email notification. I glanced at the screen, expecting spam, but the subject line stopped me coldly. Project Ironclad lead auditor required. It was a direct solicitation from a Fortune 500 firm, offering a retainer that dwarfed my brother's entire annual salary. They didn't want Sam the leftovers eater. They wanted the monster. I sat down, typed a 2-word reply, and hit send. The quiet sun was officially dead. The winter months melted away, taking the last remnants of Quiet Sam with them. My firm, Wright Forensics, expanded into a glass, walled office overlooking the harbor, a physical monument to my growing caseload. I hired 2 junior analysts to handle the grunt work, freeing me to focus on the high-level dissections I craved. I stopped wearing the baggy sweaters I used to hide in. Now, I wore tailored wool suits that fit my frame and my reputation. Success, I discovered, was the best insulation against the cold. During a cybersecurity summit in March, I met Mara. She ran a boutique law firm specializing in corporate espionage, and she looked at me like I was a partner, not a project. We skipped the keynote to drink espresso in the hotel lobby, trading war stories about cooked books and hidden assets. It was intoxicating to speak freely without filtering my vocabulary for a hostile audience. For the first time in years, I wasn't editing myself. I was just being S.J. Wright, and that was enough. But the old life has a way of seeping through the cracks. I met my cousin Kelly for lunch on a rainy Tuesday, strictly because she was the only relative who hadn't blocked me. She looked tired, stirring her lat with frantic energy. "You haven't heard, have you?" she asked, glancing around the cafe like she was sharing state secrets. "Kyle is launching something big. He calls it a unicorn." I felt a familiar tension in my jaw. "Kyle can't launch a canoe," I said flatly. Kelly leaned in, lowering her voice. "He's telling everyone it's the next big thing in blockchain security. Chainlock or something." The name sounded like a bad parody of the products I audited daily. "He's raising capital, Sam. Family capital." My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what that meant. Aunt Linda's retirement fund, my parents' home equity, the small inheritances sitting in low-yield savings accounts. Kyle wasn't just building a business. He was building a bonfire with our family's financial future. "Let them do it," I told her, though the words tasted like ash. "They made their choice at Thanksgiving." Kelly nodded sadly, not arguing, but her silence was a heavier indictment than any plea. I went back to my office, intending to bury myself in the ironclad files, but my focus was fractured. I stared at the monitors, seeing not code, but my father's worn-out hands signing checks he couldn't afford. I was done with them, but I wasn't cruel. At least I didn't think I was. 2 days later, my inbox pinged with a message that stopped my heart. The sender was K. Wright, CEO. The subject line read, "Synergies and Opportunities." I laughed out loud, a harsh sound in the quiet office. He hadn't written to apologize for the ambush or the exile. He hadn't written to check if I was alive. He was writing because he needed something. The email was a wall of buzzwords, rambling about leveraging familial talent and ground floor equity. The sheer delusion was breathtaking. I scrolled to the bottom, past the demands for a quick consult, to his signature block. Kyle Wright, visionary founder, Chainlock Global. I opened a new tab and ran a quick corporate registry search. No matches found. The company didn't legally exist. He was soliciting investment for a ghost. I hovered my mouse over the delete button, ready to sever the last thread. Instead, I created a new secure folder on my encrypted drive. I named it Evidence and dragged the email inside. I accepted the calendar invite for a strategy sync at noon, but Kyle kept me waiting until 12:15. I used the lag time to set up my recording software, routing the audio through a speech to text analyzer waiting to catch a slip. When his face finally popped onto my dual monitors, he looked polished but tired. He wore a black turtleneck that mimicked Silicon Valley visionaries, but the background was a blurred-out mess of a chaotic apartment. "Sammy," he grinned, too loud. "Glad you finally came to your senses." "I am just curious," I said, keeping my voice neutral and my face blank. "Kelly mentioned you are onto something big." Kyle leaned back, clasping his hands behind his head. He launched into a rehearsed spiel about decentralized ledgers and quantum encryption protocols. It was a word salad of tech jargon that meant absolutely nothing to an actual engineer. He claimed chainlock used biometric blockchain layering, a phrase that sounded impressive but was technically impossible. He was selling expensive sand to people who had never seen a desert. "Let me show you the alpha," Kyle said, sharing his screen. A sleek dashboard appeared, pulsing with neon blue graphs and lock icons. It looked professional, high-end, and completely static. I recognized the UI immediately. It was a $10 template from a graphic design marketplace called Vector Soul. I had flagged in an audit 3 years ago. There was no backend code, no server response time, just a glorified PowerPoint set to loop. "Proprietary architecture," Kyle boasted, tapping a button that did nothing but flash. I decided to press, just a little, to see how brittle the shell really was. "Who's handling your key management infrastructure?" I asked. "That's usually the bottleneck for quantum decryption." Kyle blinked, his smile faltering for a microsecond before the salesman mask slipped back on. "We have a team in Estonia," he waved a hand dismissively. "Top-tier guys. Lena handles the vendor relations." The mention of Lena was a tactical error. It confirmed she wasn't just a bystander, she was the architect. While Kyle droned on about projected Q3 returns, I ran a traceroute on the URL visible in his browser bar. The domain wasn't registered in Estonia or Silicon Valley. It pointed to a shell corporation in Delaware, registered 2 months ago by an agent named V. Harper. I pulled up my private database of known bad actors. Victor Harper was a career grifter who specialized in pump and dump crypto schemes. Kyle wasn't just building a bad business, he had partnered with a professional thief. "We're opening the pre-seed round to select family and friends first," Kyle said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I wanted to give you a chance to get in before the VCs take all the equity." The pitch turned predatory. He wasn't looking for technical advice, he was looking for fresh capital to pay off the initial setup costs. The Estonian team was likely just Harper draining the accounts. It was a classic Ponzi structure, fueled by affinity fraud and Thanksgiving leftovers. "I'll think about it," I lied, reaching for the mouse to end the call. "I need to see the cap table." Kyle hesitated, then briefly flashed a spreadsheet on the screen, likely trying to prove other people were buying in. I hit the screenshot key instantly. In the split second it was visible, I saw the names listed under committed capital. Right at the top, next to a $50,000 transfer, was Martha Wright. My mother had just bought a ticket on the Titanic. I met Kelly at a dive bar near the train station, a place too loud for casual eavesdropping. She nursed a gin and tonic like it was medicine, refusing to meet my eyes. I slid a printout of the shell company registration across the sticky table. "Mom put in 50 grand, I said, the number feeling heavy in my mouth. Kelly winced, tracing the rim of her glass with a shaking finger. "It's not just Aunt Martha, Sam. Grandma cashed out her bonds." The revelation about Grandma turned my stomach, leaving a sour taste that the cheap bar air couldn't mask. I went back to my apartment and spent 3 hours redacting the most aggressive legal jargon from my findings. I wanted to frame it as a standard due diligence check, a safety precaution rather than an accusation. I attached the file to an email addressed to my father, subject line, Financial exposure concerns regarding chain lock. It was clinical, precise, and undeniably true. My phone rang less than 10 minutes later. It wasn't my father on the line, but my mother, her voice trembling with a terrifying mix of rage and martyrdom. "I cannot believe you," she hissed. "Your brother finally finds his footing, and you try to cut his legs off." She didn't ask about the shell company. She didn't ask about Victor Harper. She only cared that I had dared to question the narrative of Kyle's success. The denial was absolute. "Mom, the technology doesn't exist," I said, gripping the phone tight enough to whiten my knuckles. "The interface is a $10 template. The registration leads to a known con artist." She laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Kyle told us you'd say that. He said you're jealous because he's going to be a billionaire and you're just a worker." The word hung there, stripped of all dignity. To them, I was just the help, unworthy of the vision. She hung up before I could mention the SEC. Moments later, a notification lit up my tablet. Kyle had posted a photo on Instagram, posing with Lena in front of a rented Lamborghini. The caption was a paragraph of motivational gibberish about silencing the noise and leaving the doubters behind. It had over 200 likes. Con. Aunt Linda had commented with 3 heart emojis and a prayer hand. They weren't just being scammed, they were cheering for their own destruction. Kelly texted me a screenshot of the exclusive investor update Kyle had just emailed to the family. It was full of projected growth curves and user acquisition stats. I zoomed in on the security protocol slide and my blood ran cold. The schematic wasn't generic stock art. It was a proprietary network topography map I had designed for a defense contractor 3 years ago. It was my work, stolen, rebranded, and used to rob my own mother. I felt physically sick. Kyle hadn't just used a template, he had raided my old hard drives, likely during a Christmas visit years ago when he borrowed my laptop. He was selling my credibility to fund his fraud. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, watching the city lights blur in the rain. They didn't want my warnings. They didn't want my help. I picked up my phone and dialed my lead researcher. "Get everything ready," I said. "We're going to the launch." The venue was a converted warehouse in the meatpacking district, draped in velvet to hide the water stains. Outside, 2 Lamborghinis were parked at an aggressive angle, ropes keeping pedestrians at bay. I checked the license plates as I walked past. They were rentals from a fleet in Jersey. Inside, the air smelled of cheap cologne and expensive champagne. A DJ spun ambient house music that vibrated in my chest, masking the hollow echo of a room only half full. It was a perfect stage set for a tragedy. My family was clustered near the open bar, drinking like they had already won the lottery. Uncle Bob wore a tuxedo that hadn't seen daylight since the 90s. Aunt Linda was showing her phone to a waiter, probably bragging about her equity stake. Seeing them here, surrounded by hired models and empty promises, made my throat tight. They were annoying, yes, and cruel, certainly, but they were also sheep walking willingly into a thresher. I touched the flash drive in my pocket, the metal grounding me against the noise. A hand clamped onto my forearm, fingers digging into the wool of my suit. I turned to find Lena smiling up at me, her teeth white and predatory. She wore a diamond watch that I recognized from the expense reports. It cost more than my mother's car. "I didn't think you'd have the guts to show up," she whispered, her voice sugary sweet. "Here to apologize, or just here to see what real success looks like." Her confidence was brittle, held together by adrenaline and other people's money. "I am just here for the demo," I said, pulling my arm free. Lena swirled her drink, ice clinking against the glass. "Kyle is going to change the world tonight, Sam. You should have just been supportive. Maybe we would have cut you in." She winked, a gesture so condescending it almost made me laugh. She didn't fear me anymore because she thought she had won. She believed the lie so thoroughly that she couldn't see the cliff edge. I watched her walk away, marking her as the target. The lights dimmed, plunging the room into dramatic shadow. A spotlight snapped onto the stage, blindingly bright, as Kyle jogged out to thunderous applause. He looked the part of the visionary, wearing a headset microphone and sneakers that cost $1,000. "Welcome to the future of security," he boomed, his voice amplified to a god-like volume. My mother shrieked with delight from the front row. Kyle paced the stage, gesturing at a screen that displayed a spinning, metallic padlock. It was theater, pure and simple, designed to bypass logic. I moved toward the side of the room, keeping to the shadows, intending to wait for the cue and A session to drop the hammer. But Kyle, high on narcissism, went off script. He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on me in the darkness. A cruel smile spread across his face. "You know, we even have skeptics in the house," he announced, pointing a finger directly at me. "My brother Sam. He's a consultant. Sam, come up here. Tell everyone what you think of the architecture." The room turned. A spotlight swung around, pinning me against the wall. The glare was physical, a hot white weight. This was his plan, to use my presence as a prop, to make my silence look like tacit endorsement. If I refused, I looked weak. If I went up, I was complicit. I looked at my father, Con, who was beaming, waiting for me to finally play my part in the family pageant. I took a breath, adjusted my cuffs, and stepped into the light. The decision was made. The walk to the stage felt miles long. The floorboards vibrated with the bass, thumping in time with my heart. I climbed the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my dress shoes. Kyle clapped me on the back, the heavy, possessive pat of an older brother who thinks he owns you. "Don't be shy, Sammy," he whispered, off mic. "Just nod and say it's robust. Do it for Mom." He handed me the microphone, his eyes hard and warning. He thought he was handing me a leash. I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. To my right, a man in a hoodie sat behind a laptop, introduced earlier as the lead engineer. I looked at him closely for the first time. I recognized him not from GitHub, but from a casting website I used to vet fake employees during audits. His name was Gary, and he was an aspiring actor who specialized in commercials. There was no engineering team. There was just Gary and a playlist. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The fraud wasn't just technical, it was total. I looked at the laptop connected to the massive projector screen. It was running a simple video loop, unprotected and open. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Not the flash drive. "Actually, Kyle," I said, my voice echoing through the silent hall. "I think a live demonstration would be better." I tapped the screen mirroring icon. The projector flickered, the spinning padlock stalling out. The giant screen behind me blinked, the spinning 3D padlock vanishing into digital static. In its place, the raw file directory of the chainlock server appeared, magnified to 20 feet tall. It was a stark, white void containing a single folder labeled Assets and a JPEG of the logo. A collective gasp rippled through the audience as the illusion of complexity dissolved into nothingness. Kyle stiffened beside me, his hand hovering over the podium, his smile frozen in a rictus of panic. The silence wasn't respectful anymore, it was confused. "This is the proprietary architecture Kyle sold you," I said, my voice flat and clinical. I clicked the folder open, revealing nothing but empty sub-directories. Con. There was no encryption key, no blockchain ledger, and no biometric database. I turned to look at Gary, the actor posing as the lead engineer, who was sweating through his hoodie. He slowly closed his laptop, distancing himself from the disaster unfolding above him. "There is no product," I continued, facing the crowd. "There is only a website template and a bank account." I swiped left on my phone, bringing up the next slide, a scrolling list of outgoing wire transfers. The numbers were large, red, and undeniable. "Your investment capital didn't go to research and development," I narrated, pointing to the line items. "It went to luxury car rentals, a penthouse deposit in Soho, and $40,000 in jewelry." I heard a sharp, strangled cry from the front row. Aunt Linda was staring at the screen, her hand pressed over her mouth, recognizing the cost of her retirement. Kyle snapped out of his paralysis, lunging for the microphone with desperate, flailing hands. "Technical difficulties," he shouted, Con, his voice cracking with hysteria. "He's hacking the feed! Security, get him off the stage!" He shoved me hard, but I planted my feet, letting him bounce off my shoulder. The physical aggression broke the spell for the audience. The investors, men with thick necks and short tempers, began to stand up. Their confusion was rapidly hardening into rage. They didn't look at the screen anymore. They looked at Kyle. I sidestepped Kyle's second attempt to grab my phone and tapped the screen one last time. A PDF document filled the wall, stamped with the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. "This is a whistleblower complaint filed this morning," I announced, pitching my voice over the rising clamor. It details 4 counts of wire fraud and unregistered securities violations. My mother stood up, her face drained of color, looking between her 2 sons. She wasn't angry at the lie anymore. She was terrified of the truth. "Cut the power!" Kyle screamed at the sound booth, veins bulging in his neck. "Kill it now!" The stage went black as the technician finally obeyed, plunging us into darkness. But the image of the federal complaint seemed to linger on the retina, burned into the room's collective memory. In the sudden dark, the sound of panic amplified. Chairs scraped against the concrete floor. Glass shattered somewhere near the bar. "It's over, Kyle," I said into the void. "You can't turn off the law." The harsh overhead work lights slammed on, stripping away the velvet glamour of the evening. The room looked cheap and dirty in the unforgiving glare. I looked down at my father, who was slumped in his folding chair, looking older than I had ever seen him. He met my gaze, his eyes watery and pleading, begging me to fix what I had broken. "I didn't break this family," I said loud enough for him to hear. "I just turned on the lights." He looked away, ashamed. The heavy metal doors at the back of the warehouse banged open, admitting a gust of cold air and 4 uniformed officers. A man in a cheap suit followed them, scanning the room with bored efficiency. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide channel toward the stage. Kyle froze, his hands still raised as if to ward off a blow. He looked at me, his eyes wide and wet, a child again. "Sammy," he whispered. "Fix it." I just shook my head. It was unfixable. Lena emerged from the shadows near the exit, moving fast, her clutch held tight to her chest. She pointed a manicured finger at Kyle as the officers approached. "He lied to me too," she shrieked, playing the victim card with practiced ease. "I was just an employee." I pulled up a text thread on my phone and held it out to the lead officer. "She structured the shell companies," I said calmly. "Here are her specific instructions on how to hide the assets." Lena's face crumbled. The officers moved in, surrounding the stage, their radios crackling with static. I didn't stay to watch the handcuffs click shut. I stepped down from the podium, bypassing the chaos of shouting investors and sobbing relatives. My mother called my name, a broken, wailing sound, but I didn't turn back. I walked past the rented Lamborghinis and the velvet ropes, pushing through the rear exit into the alley. The night air was freezing and smelled of exhaust, but to me, it felt like the cleanest oxygen on Earth. It was exactly 1 year since the warehouse raid, and the silence in my kitchen was the most expensive thing I owned. I wasn't fighting over leftovers or dodging passive, aggressive insults about my career. Instead, I stood over a cast iron skillet, searing a dry, aged rebay with precise, meditative movements. The apartment smelled of rosemary and garlic, not burnt sage and desperation. My phone sat on the counter, screen down, silent. I had blocked the family group chat months ago. There were no notifications to dread, no drama to manage, just the sizzling of steak and rain against the glass. The peace was interrupted by the pile of mail I had ignored on the entryway table. On top sat a cream-colored envelope with familiar, loopy cursive script. It had no return address, but I knew the handwriting immediately. It was my mother's. For a moment, my pulse spiked, a phantom reflex from a lifetime of conditioning. I picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper. It felt heavy, like it carried a burden I hadn't agreed to lift. I carried it to the fireplace, debating whether to open it. Curiosity is a dangerous habit, but I sliced the seal. I expected anger, or maybe a plea for forgiveness, but the letter was a transaction masked as sentiment. She wrote about family unity in the first paragraph and legal defense funds in the second. Kyle was facing 5 years. Lena had turned state's witness to save herself. They needed $50,000 for a forensic accountant to challenge the SEC's findings. The irony nearly made me laugh. They wanted my money to hire a discount version of me to fight the evidence I had provided. There was no, "How are you?" There was only, "We need." The entitlement hadn't died. It just got desperate. I didn't finish reading the third page. I crumpled the heavy stationery into a tight ball, the texture rough against my palm. I walked over to the gas fireplace and tossed the paper onto the ceramic logs. The flames caught the edge instantly, curling the cream paper into black ash. I watched my mother's handwriting dissolve. The pleas for money, the guilt trips, the manipulation, all turning into smoke that was sucked up the flue. I didn't feel the familiar pang of guilt. I felt a sudden, expansive lightness in my chest. The cord was finally cut. I wasn't their savior. I was just Sam. My tablet pinged with a business alert, breaking my trance. I tapped the screen, wiping a smudge of ash from the glass. It was a confirmation from my broker regarding a blind auction for distressed assets. My firm had just acquired the legitimate remnants of Chainlock, mostly the trademark and the domain name, for pennies on the dollar. It wasn't revenge, it was just good business. I stared at the transaction complete banner. I now owned the thing that had destroyed them. I closed the tab without smiling. It was just numbers on a screen, devoid of emotional weight. I plated the steak and poured a glass of that rare Japanese whiskey, taking a seat at the head of my mahogany dining table. The other 5 chairs were empty, pushed in neatly. A year ago, an empty chair was a symbol of my exclusion, a hole where a sun should have been. Now it was just furniture, space, room to breathe. I raised my glass to the empty room, to the silence, and to the man reflected in the darkened window. Happy Thanksgiving, I whispered to myself. The whiskey burned on the way down. Warm and real, I took a bite. It was perfect.